Good afternoon. Welcome to our RaboResearch Food and Ag Reports. I'm news anchor reporter Megan Grebner. Today we are talking about NAFTA and the dairy sector, and with us is Perry. Good afternoon.
Hi, Megan.
As we get started, NAFTA has been in the news a lot lately, so have trade agreements in general. Let's kind of get up to speed on what's going on with NAFTA.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to start. So it was interesting when we started looking at this subject here at Rabo, and especially specifically as pertains to dairy. We realized that we changed the narrative about NAFTA several times in the last 6-12 months, and we went from everything as to say that trade agreements are bad for our farmers, for agriculture in general, and we were ready to pull out of all of them, and then the narrative changed, and as I think we all learned more in the process, some of them seem better and some of them seem worse, and NAFTA definitely seemed like something that we should continue and think about better ways of addressing the current issues, since it's an old agreement. So something that's 23 years old at this point doesn't cover everything that we need to be covering in the industry, in the agriculture industry in general. So I think that's changed, and I think it was to a relief of many people who do count on free trade and trade with our Mexican and Canadian partners, and also dairy farmers on top of all that.
As we take a look at NAFTA and the dairy sector, let's start first and talk a little bit about the impact and maybe how things have changed over the past 23 years of the agreement, and what has happened as it relates to the dairy market.
Yes. So when you look at our two major trading partners, the amount of trade we've had before NAFTA was signed and went to force was really small, and it increased over time. And in the last 10 years, Mexico became our largest dairy or importer of U.S. dairy products. And that's a significant amount, because we in the U.S. export about 15% of dairy that we produce. So we're generally focused on the domestic market, but that 15% really, plays a role. And over 50% of that 15% goes to NAFTA countries. So Mexico and Canada are the two major buyers of U.S. dairy products, and they're definitely the best position to buy, and we're in the best position to actually sell it to them. Overall, since we have an easy access through we don't, it's either via boat or truck or whatever, but they're a lot closer to any other potential buyer of our product. How it's changed? Well, dairy in itself is generally a very protected category, and each dairy producing country definitely try to protect their dairy farmers as much as possible. So in many of those agreements, dairy is one of those categories that is the trade is limited. And we were fortunate in having a really open access to Mexico, and they are net importer of dairy products. They're not self-sufficient. They're about 80% self-sufficient in dairy, which means that we really support their consumption of dairy products. As far as Canada, they were a lot less reliant. They're a market that's regulated. It's butter regulated, so they really set their quota based on the amount of butter fat that they want to have available for their domestic market, and they're really reluctant to take a lot of dairy product from outside of Canada. So that's been the kind of general story of where the dairy trade's been going over the last 23 years. And I think what happens now is that dairy in itself was not really a big concern for NAFTA, but there are other, intellectual property rights and other things that came up or are coming up or kind of exist over the last decade or so in agriculture and in general in the trade that weren't addressed by NAFTA, and those were the major topics that have to be addressed in the new agreement. And that's why we're looking at renegotiation.
As we take a look at renegotiating or modernizing NAFTA, as you talk to some of the other livestock sectors, they don't want to see a lot of changes. What are some things that the dairy industry would like to see and thinks are important as we look at modernizing this agreement?
I think overall, what we like to believe is that it's going to be beneficial. So it's definitely an agreement that from this point on is going to grant us more access to other markets, not less. And I think there are two main takeaways that I think that are important to mention. And one is that with renegotiation of NAFTA, we believe that we will get better access to Canadian market. And I think for a good reason, we're efficient and we have good producers, good products to send to Canada. And if they want to be our partner in other trade, they will have to agree to a certain extent to grant us more access to the Canadian market. The other important part is that as Mexican population is getting wealthier, they will consume more dairy, and if from a nutrition standpoint, from having a little bit of cheese with your wine standpoint, it's always a market that will continue to grow, and I think that's a good place for us to keep getting our foot in the door and increase that amount. The other topic that's not addressed directly by NAFTA, but if we get to the negotiation point, is the labor issue, and especially labor issue in the dairy industry. It's been a hot topic for a long time, and depending on which farmers and organizations you talk to, you get everywhere from 50 to 80% to 90% of dairy labor being Hispanic, and majority of those workers come from Mexico, and often they are undocumented, and that became an issue for a lot of dairy farmers, and especially with the current narrative, it became more difficult and more scary as you are risking losing your majority of your labor force, and so we believe that generally the renegotiation of the agreement provides a better stance for us to maybe regulate or figure out that labor issue and help our dairy farmers find the more sustainable labor source with help of the Mexican government.
Can we talk a little bit about the labor aspect of that, Aga? As you get into it, how much does the uncertainty that revolves around those labor issues play back into concerns for dairy farmers when they look at profitability, when they look at their ability to do their job and produce product? And how does that impact the markets as well?
That's a very good question. It's actually kind of scary. And when you talk to farmers, especially the ones that are, to scale or big enough that they really rely on hired labor, they're concerned. And a lot of them, see their laborers being afraid to go to work or afraid to go to the store in the nearby town, just to not expose themselves in a situation where they're not sure if somebody comes in, if they're going to get sent home or not. And often there are people who lived here for a very long time, and definitely on the farmer side, there is concern, and they've been advocating for changes in the labor visa programs that will allow them to hire Mexican help legally. But it hasn't been addressed yet. So there's definitely a lot of concern, and you hear scary stories of government officials coming in and taking away labor from farmers, and that's happened not a lot, but it did. And I think overall the sentiment is there, and they're not thrilled. Overall, I think in many ways that pushes farmers to be innovative, and as much as I think we'll see a better situation for the Mexican workforce, I think it also pushes farmers to adopt new technologies. So many of them, if they have the resources, they will invest in robotics to decrease their reliance on the manual labor and go with a higher level technology. It's a big investment, but it definitely helps mitigate some of that cost. So there's a lot of things going on. Overall, I think the uncertainty is there, but I think we tend to live day to day, and ultimately, at the very end, it's the economics that drives everything else. Economics that drives politics, not the other way around. So we do our business as usual, and kind of hope to see what's going to happen in the future. That's going to be better.
You mentioned 15% go into of the market goes into Canada and Mexico, correct?
Yes.
So as we take a look at that, what are let's maybe break down each one of those countries and look at some options and some issues with each one of them. Let's start with Mexico.
Yeah, so I think with the Mexican market, the interesting part for us is that they learn how to take our products. So in the US, we're very specific about what we make. So it's the 40-pound barrels of cheese and non-fat dry milk, pretty much a standard that nobody else conforms to. And it takes, and the overall narrative in the US used to be take it or leave it. So we make it our way, and then you either like it, then you'll take it, or we'll give it to somebody else. And I think that narrative is changing. So as Mexico is an important market, and they will continue to take that specialty product, that different product that is not to an international standard, I think in the future we're looking to adjust our U.S. market to more international standards. So, instead of non-fat dry milk, we have skim milk powder, and kind of those standards to be closer to whatever is traded internationally, which on the one hand, I think will change the picture for the Mexican market that is looking to import from other sources than U.S. And I think from a economy standpoint, it's good to diversify. But at the same time, we're changing here in the U.S. and we're looking to conform to those international standards, and we're looking to make our product more internationally appealing.
There's been a lot of discussion earlier in the year about some issues with Canada. Does that come into play here as well, and maybe modernizing and working on issues there?
So I probably you're referring to Class 7 milk, which yes, there has been a lot of talk, and I think what happened with the Class 7 milk is that when we signed all the agreements with Canada, Class 7 milk did not exist, or the ultra-filtered product that we actually were exporting, our border states, so Wisconsin or Michigan, we're exporting to Canada, didn't really exist. That wasn't a thing 20-something years ago. And since then, we kind of used that loophole in the regulations that's something that wasn't in it, that we could sell really easily to the Canadian producer or Canadian processors. And obviously, both parties benefited. They got cheaper milk supply. We got to sell our milk to Canada. It worked pretty well, but local producers, so Canadian producers, became concerned that this is a loophole that we might have been overusing. And they pushed for identifying Class 7 milk as something that's regulated under their system, and they have their own price support for it, which means that Class 7 milk became more price competitive compared to our U.S. milk in the Canadian market, and which meant that it was easier for the Canadian processor to buy Class 7 milk from Canadian producer as opposed to importing it from the U.S. And sort of, so that's where that whole battle is happening. What I think is important to mention, so we talk about a little bit, or the media talks about retaliatory battle between the US and Canada on tariffs. And we talked about soft lumber tariff, 20% soft lumber tariff that was reinstated after the announcement about the Class 7 milk, which is interesting because that's actually returning to the status quo. We used to have that tariff before it expired. That was reinstated after the announcement of the Class 7 milk. Well, it's sort of going back to what we used to have. Doesn't make a huge difference. What I think is worth mentioning is, though, that with the butterfat regulatory supply management system in Canada, what they end up having is oversupply of skim milk powder, or oversupply of protein, which ends up being skim milk powder, and they block imports into Canada from other places of dairy products, but at the same time, they have a mandate to export that excess protein outside of Canada, which is I think the biggest concern for the global dairy market, where you have a country with a very protected domestic dairy industry, and at the same time, still allowing for that excess produced under the managed system, exported into other markets and into the global market.
Anything else, Aga, that we need to think about as we look at the uncertainties that surround NAFTA and its impacts on the dairy industry?
I think what I would really caution, everybody about when we talk about NAFTA and when we talk about free trade agreements is that they take a lot of time and effort to negotiate. We think about TPP, that before we decided to pull out of TPP, it took 7 years to get to an agreement. When you look historically at any free trade agreements that affect agriculture that U.S. has at this time, they took anywhere from 2, 4, 6, 8 years from the moment where the negotiations started or to a point where the agreement was actually signed and went into force. So what we're looking at most likely is several years of negotiations and going back and forth, several meetings, and different segments of economy that will have to be aligned between those, U.S., Canada, and Mexico before we can even talk about any changes. What my hope is overall is that during that process we're actually going to agree in the end, and that's sort of, I think, a very good thing to say, and I think that's what we should expect. But it's going to be a process, and it's going to take a while, regardless of what the overall climate around it is. We'll have to wait. We'll have to wait, and it's a process, and will take a while before we get to that final result.
Okay, anything else?
I think that's most on my end, unless you have any other questions.
Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, and thank you again for your time.
Thanks.
I'm Megan Grebner on Brownfield.